The desert wind tasted like the end of the world, dust and smoke. Ida Gaines was 26, and she figured her life was just getting started. Beside her sat Will, her husband, his hands steady on the reins, his eyes fixed on the horizon. They'd left everything behind in Missouri, chasing a ghost of a promise along the Santa Fe Trail. Land, they said. Freedom, they whispered. Their wagon was light, but their hopes were heavy enough to bend the axles. Hardship had already drawn new lines on their faces, but they were young and stubborn, and they held onto each other like a promise. Late afternoon sun baked the red rock bluffs as they rolled into a trading post. It wasn't much of a place. Looked like it was thrown together in a hurry and then forgotten, left for the sun to bleach its walls to the color of bone. A few other wagons were circled up, and men with dusty coats and empty eyes leaned against the porch rail. Their rifles were never more than an arm's length away. You could feel the tension in the air before you even stepped inside. It was thick, heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Will squeezed Ida's hand, his palm rough and warm. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "We get what we need, and we're gone." But the moment they stepped through the door, they walked into a fire. The room was a mess of shouting men, traders arguing over whiskey prices, their voices cracking with greed and suspicion. Each man accused the other of cheating, of watering down the liquor, of weighting the scales. At the far end of the room, standing silent and still, were several Apache men. Their faces were calm, like masks carved from stone, but their eyes missed nothing. Every settler in the room shot them looks that could kill. The air grew hotter, tighter, words became knives. Ida pulled her shawl around her shoulders, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear into the shadows. She wanted nothing to do with this. She just wanted the open trail again, the quiet of the night sky, the feel of Will's arm around her. Then she heard it. A sound that cut through all the shouting, the sharp, ugly click of a rifle hammer being pulled back. A trader, his face slick with sweat and fear, barked a single command. "Get out of here!" His eyes were locked on the Apache men. One of them, a warrior with a long scar across his cheek, stepped forward. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, a gesture of peace. He was trying to quiet the storm. But it was too late. The moment had already tipped over the edge. You could feel it. The world held its breath for a single, terrible second. The first shot was like a thunderclap in the tiny room. It ripped through the haze of smoke and sweat, deafening, final. And then all hell broke loose. Gunfire cracked from every corner. Men screamed, wood splintered. Black powder smoke rolled up in thick, choking clouds, stinging Ida's eyes, filling her throat. She ducked low, grabbing for Will's arm, trying to pull him toward the door, toward escape. Another blast echoed, and a body slammed into the bar, scattering bottles of cheap whiskey. Will shoved her hard, pushing her toward the cover of an overturned table. "Go!" he yelled. But before he could follow, he staggered. His whole body jerked, like he'd been hit by an invisible fist. For a split second, Ida didn't understand. She saw no wound, no blood. And then she saw it. A dark stain, spreading like a wicked flower across the front of his simple cotton shirt. Red. So red. His eyes went wide with shock, not pain, just pure, awful surprise. He tried to take a step toward her, his hand reaching out, but his knees buckled. "Will!" The scream was torn from her throat, a raw, ragged sound she didn't recognize as her own. She scrambled toward him through the chaos, tripping, falling hard to her knees on the filthy floorboards. Bullets whizzed past her head, thudding into the walls, but she didn't see them. She didn't hear them. All she could hear was the ragged, wet sound of Will's breathing. She cradled his head in her lap, her tears falling onto his dirt-streaked face, mixing with the sweat and the dust. He was trying to say something, his lips forming words she couldn't catch. His hand twitched, a faint, desperate flutter against hers, and then it fell still. His gaze, which had always been so full of warmth and laughter, dimmed, and then it was gone. He was gone. Ida pressed her forehead to his, rocking back and forth as the world exploded around them. The sounds of the fight faded into a dull roar. Men were running now, their boots pounding on the wooden floor as they scrambled for the door, leaving the dead and the dying behind. The acrid smell of gunpowder clung to everything, but she couldn't move. She just held him. It wasn't until a dead silence fell over the room, broken only by the wind rattling a loose shutter, that she finally lifted her head. The floor was a nightmare of blood and spilled liquor. Bodies were scattered like broken dolls, and no one was looking at her. The survivors were gone, taking their fear with them into the twilight. Ida was alone with her husband, and the whole world felt like it was tilting on its axis, ready to slide her into a darkness from which she would never return. She had to get him out of there, before the animals came, before the men came back. With a strength she didn't know she had, she dragged his body outside, his heels scraping a terrible path in the dirt. The sky was a bruised, angry purple, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. She had no shovel, no tools. All she had were her own 2 hands and a small wooden spoon from their cooking kit. It seemed like a sick joke. How do you bury the man you love, the man who was your entire world, with a spoon? But she couldn't leave him. She just couldn't. Just beyond the trading post, she found a small patch of ground and dropped to her knees. She started to dig. The soil was dry and stubborn, full of rocks that tore at her palms, ripping her skin. She didn't care. She scraped and clawed at the earth, sobbing with each handful she threw aside, her tears mixing with the rain and the dirt. The hole was a pathetic thing, shallow and crude, but it was all she had the strength to make. With trembling arms, she gently pulled Will's body into the grave. She laid him down as softly as she could, arranging his hands on his chest. His face looked gray and peaceful in the fading light, his shirt stiff and dark with his own blood. From a small pocket in her dress, she pulled out a square of white cloth. It was a handkerchief she had stitched for him just before their wedding, with a simple W embroidered in the corner. She pressed it to her lips, inhaling the faint scent of him that still clung to it, and then tucked it safely back into her bodice. "I'll keep this," she whispered to the wind. "I'll keep you with me." There was no minister to say the words, no one to sing a hymn. There was only Ida's voice, cracked and broken, speaking a half-remembered prayer into the rising storm. She asked God to take him somewhere safe, somewhere she couldn't follow. When the words ran out, she began to cover him with the earth. She pushed the dirt over his chest, his face, his hands, until there was nothing left but a raw mound of earth, already turning dark in the pouring rain. By the time she was finished, the storm had fully broken. Sheets of water pounded the ground, soaking her dress until it clung to her skin like a shroud, plastering her hair to her face. She sat back on her heels, staring at the rough grave, a hollow ache in her chest so vast it felt like it had swallowed her whole. A fork of lightning split the sky, and for a brief, terrible moment, it illuminated a crude cross she had made from 2 sticks, tied together with a strip of leather from her boot. It leaned crookedly in the mud, a sorry marker for a life so full of promise. But it was something. It was a promise that he had been here, that he had lived. The trading post was a dark, silent shape against the stormy sky, its windows like vacant eyes. Ida didn't look back. She couldn't. She gathered the few things she could carry, her shawl, a bundle of bread that was already going stale, and the wooden spoon, still caked with the earth from his grave. Then she turned her face to the west and started walking. The trail stretched out before her, a muddy ribbon disappearing into the blackness of the horizon. She had no map, no companions, nothing but the sucking sound of her boots in the mud and the weight of a silence so profound it felt like a physical thing pressing in on her. The laughter she had shared with Will, the quiet dreams they had whispered to each other under the stars, all of it was gone, vanished. All that was left was a widow, alone on a frontier that had no mercy for the weak. And yet, she walked on. Her hands were bleeding, her clothes were freezing against her skin, and her eyes stung with salt and rain. A part of her wanted to just lie down beside that crooked cross and never get up again. But some other part of her, a tiny, stubborn ember of life, pushed her forward. The prairie opened up around her, vast and empty and indifferent. It was the kind of land that could swallow a person whole and no one would ever know. But Ida just kept moving, walking straight into the storm, the raw, gaping hole in her chest, the only compass she had. The storm raged all through the night, a relentless assault of wind and rain. Ida walked until her legs gave out, until her body was trembling so violently she could barely stand. She finally collapsed beneath a small cluster of mesquite trees, pulling her soaked shawl around her, shivering uncontrollably. Thunder rolled across the high desert like the devil's own cannon fire, and lightning cracked the sky open, showing her glimpses of a world that was all sharp edges and deep shadows. The grief inside her was a living thing, a hungry animal hollowing her out from the inside. By dawn, the storm had eased into a gray, weary drizzle, but Ida felt no relief. She forced herself to eat a scrap of stale bread, chewing it into a tasteless paste that she could barely swallow. The land around her was a barren wasteland of scrub brush and deep gullies carved by flash floods. There were no wagons on the trail, no smoke rising from a distant chimney. There was only emptiness. She staggered forward, her vision blurring with exhaustion. Every step was an agony, her boots sinking into the soft, wet earth. And then she saw it. A dark gash in the side of a cliff, a shallow cave, or maybe just an overhang, but it was shelter. It was something. She lurched toward it, stumbling over loose rocks, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. All she wanted was a place to get out of the rain, a place to be still for just an hour, a place to let the world stop spinning. She pushed her way into the narrow opening, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. And her heart stopped dead in her chest. Slumped against the far wall of the cave, barely visible in the gloom, was a man. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. His skin was slick with the sheen of a high fever. Dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and a crude bandage on his side was soaked through with blood. His clothes were torn buckskin, his boots worn thin, and his face, sharp cheekbones, bronze skin, the dark slash of his eyelashes against his cheek. He was Apache. Ida stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The cave wall was cold and hard against her back. The memories of the trading post came flooding back in a tidal wave of terror. The crack of the rifles, the shouts, the glimpse of men with braided hair and fierce eyes in the swirling smoke. Will falling, the red stains spreading across his shirt. Her breath came in fast, shallow pants. Her body trembled with a feeling so intense it was almost paralyzing. It was a cocktail of pure, primal terror and a white-hot rage that threatened to consume her. It would be so easy to just leave him, to turn around, walk back out into the rain, and let him die. No one would ever know. And who would blame her? He was one of them. One of the men who had been there when her world ended. An eye for an eye. It was the law of this land. But she didn't move. She was frozen in place, her eyes fixed on the faint, fragile movement of his chest. His lips parted, and a sound escaped. A soft moan of pain, or maybe a word in a language she didn't understand. His hand twitched, reaching instinctively for the wound in his side. The bandage was useless, just a dark, sticky mess. He was bleeding out. If she left, he would be dead by nightfall. "Lord, help me," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. "I can't do this." And yet, she found her feet moving. She crossed the small space between them, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in the silence of the cave. She knelt beside him, her hand hovering over the wound, afraid to touch him. His skin was burning hot. She'd felt a fever like this before, years ago, when her father was dying of pneumonia. She had sat by his bed for days, wiping his brow, listening to the death rattle in his throat until it finally stopped. She could hear that same sound hovering in this stranger's chest now. She took a deep, shaky breath. "You're no different," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Her hands were still shaking, but she forced them to be steady. "Just a man bleeding like any other." She ripped a long strip from the hem of her wet dress and pressed it firmly against the wound. The man stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. For a heart-stopping moment, his eyes locked on hers. They were dark, deep, and unreadable, but she saw no hatred in them, only pain. He muttered something, the syllables low and rough, and tried to raise a hand. It wasn't a threat. It felt like a plea. "Hush," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "Save your strength." He blinked slowly, a flicker of confusion in his dark eyes, and then his head fell back against the stone wall. His breathing seemed to steady just a little, though each inhale was still a struggle. Ida worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best she could with rainwater she collected in a tin cup from her bundle. She tied a new bandage, made from another strip of her dress, tightly around his torso. The cave filled with the coppery smell of blood and damp leather. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, utterly exhausted. He lay still, but his chest was still moving. That was something. That was more than she'd had an hour ago. She drew her knees to her chest, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders, and listened to the rain drumming on the rocks outside. Every few minutes, she glanced over at him, half expecting his eyes to fly open, to see the fury she had been so sure she would find there. But he just slept, lost in a world of fever and pain, occasionally murmuring words she would never understand. The day dragged on. Ida dozed in fits and starts, waking with a jolt at every roll of thunder. Hunger was a dull ache in her belly, but she saved the last of her bread, just in case he lived until morning. By dusk, the rain had slowed to a fine mist, and a chill settled into the cave. She looked at the man, shivering in his fevered sleep. Without thinking, she unfolded her shawl and draped it over both of them, tucking the edge under his arm to keep him warm. The gesture surprised her. It felt intimate, wrong, but once it was done, she couldn't bring herself to undo it. That night, she dreamed of Will. He was calling to her from across a great distance, his voice carried on the storm, telling her to run, to save herself. She woke with tears on her cheeks to find the Apache's eyes open, watching her in the dim pre-dawn light. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. His gaze was steady, unwavering. Slowly, with great effort, he lifted a hand and tapped his own chest. Then he rasped a single word, a word in English. "Wade." Ida just stared at him. She had expected a grunt, a threat, anything but this. "Wade?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "That's your name?" He gave a faint nod, then was racked by a series of deep, tearing coughs. She quickly poured some water into her tin cup and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, some of it spilling down his chin. When he finished, he sank back against the wall, his eyes closing with exhaustion. "You should rest," she said softly. "Don't try to talk." But the name echoed in her mind. Wade. It was a name, not just a face in a crowd of enemies. It made him a person, a man. She sat back, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, and wondered what in God's name she had just done. What did it mean that she had chosen to save him? As she shifted to get more comfortable, her hand brushed against a small, hard object tucked into his belt. She hadn't noticed it before. Curious, she gently pulled it free. It was a locket. A small, silver locket, dented and tarnished. Her fingers trembled as she pried it open. Inside, nestled against the worn velvet, was a tiny portrait of a woman. A white woman, with blonde hair and a gentle smile. And beside the portrait, scratched crudely into the silver, were the initials J.B. Ida's blood ran cold. This wasn't his. This couldn't be his. This belonged to a settler, and there was only one way an Apache warrior would have a locket like this. He had taken it. He was a killer. A murderer of women, perhaps. The man whose life she had just saved was not just an enemy. He was a monster. Ida scrambled away from him, pressing herself against the far wall of the cave, the cold silver locket burning in her hand. Her mind was screaming. The face in the locket blurred with the memory of Will's face, his eyes going vacant. The man lying just a few feet away, the man she had just bandaged and given water to and covered with her own shawl, was a killer. He had probably been at the trading post. He had probably fired one of the shots that had ripped her life apart. The rage she felt was so pure, so absolute, it was almost cleansing. She looked at the rocks scattered on the cave floor. It would be so easy. He was weak. He was sleeping. One good, hard blow to the head, and it would be over. Justice for Will. Justice for the woman in the locket. Her hand closed around a heavy, sharp-edged rock. Her knuckles were white. Her breath was coming in short, sharp bursts. She could do it. She should do it. She took a step toward him. The rock held high. The world narrowed to the space between them, to the sleeping form of the man who had destroyed her life. His breathing was still shallow, but it was steady. A life she had saved. A life she was about to take. But then she looked at his face. In the dim light, with the fever flush on his cheeks, he looked younger, almost vulnerable. The anger and the violence of the trading post seemed a world away. This was just a man, wounded and dying in a cave. Just like Will had been. The thought was a physical blow, and the rock suddenly felt impossibly heavy in her hand. What was she doing? Was this who she was now? A killer? Would this bring Will back? Would it mend the gaping hole in her heart? No, it would just make her one of them. The rock slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the cave floor. The sound was deafening in the silence. Wade's eyes fluttered open. He looked at the rock, then at her face. He saw the tears streaming down her cheeks, the wild look in her eyes. He didn't look afraid. He just looked sad. She sank to the floor, all the fight gone out of her, and just sobbed. She cried for Will, for herself, for the woman in the locket, for a world where things like this could happen. She cried until she had no tears left, until she was just a hollowed-out shell of a woman, huddled in the dark corner of a cave with her husband's killer. She must have fallen asleep, because when she opened her eyes, the sun was streaming into the mouth of the cave. Wade was sitting up, leaning against the wall. His eyes were clearer. The fever seemed to have broken. He was watching her. She flinched, remembering the rock, the hatred she had felt. She expected to see that same hatred reflected in his eyes. But there was only a quiet watchfulness. He saw the locket, still clutched in her hand. He gestured toward it weakly. "Jeb," he said, his voice a dry rasp. Ida stared at him, confused. "Jeb?" He nodded. "Jebediah Brown, his." He pointed a finger at the locket. "He was traitor, bad man." Ida shook her head, not wanting to believe him. "You killed him?" she accused, her voice trembling. "You took this from him after you killed him." Wade held her gaze, and his eyes were full of a truth so raw it made her ache. "Yes," he said simply. "I kill him." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "After he kill your man." The words hit Ida like a physical blow. She couldn't breathe. "What?" "At trading post," Wade said, his English broken but his meaning brutally clear. "Jeb, he shoot first. He shoot many. He shoot your man." Wade's hand went to his own bandaged side. "I fight him. I stop him. He was animal. He looked down at the locket in her hand. That was his wife. He show picture to everyone. Brag how he beat her, how he leave her for dead back in Kansas. Wade's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but the story he told was horrifying. He was the one, the man with the sweat on his face and the crazy in his eyes. I saw him. I saw him raise his rifle. I saw him shoot Will. Ida's world tilted again. The man she thought was her husband's killer was the man who had avenged him. The monster she was ready to kill was the only person who had sought justice for Will in that bloody, chaotic room. She looked from the locket to Wade's face, her mind reeling. The simple lines of good and evil, of settler and savage, that had been so clear just moments ago, were now hopelessly blurred. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. She was alive because of this man, and she had almost killed him. The weight of that realization was crushing. She looked at the man, Wade, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the pain in his eyes, the exhaustion etched into his face, the deep scar that ran along his forearm, an old wound, long healed. This was not a boy. This was a man who had seen more than his share of violence, who had survived things she couldn't even imagine. And in that bloody trading post, their paths had crossed in the most terrible way possible. "Thank you," she whispered, the words tasting strange on her tongue. Wade just gave a slow, tired nod. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the unspoken truths hanging in the air between them. They were no longer enemies. They were something else now, something more complicated. They were survivors, bound together by a single, violent moment in time. Over the next few days, a strange rhythm developed between them. Wade's strength slowly returned. On the third day, he insisted on standing, pushing himself up against the cave wall, swaying like a young tree in a high wind. Ida rushed to steady him, her hands on his warm, solid arms. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, before easing himself back down with a grunt. "You're stubborn," she muttered, a hint of a smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He gave the ghost of a smile back. "Strong," he said, tapping his chest. Ida almost laughed. Was that what he thought of himself? Or was it what he saw in her, the woman who had dragged him back from the brink of death? On the fourth day, their food ran out. Ida had stretched her meager supplies as far as they would go, but now there was nothing left. Wade saw the worry in her eyes. He motioned for her to stay put, and then, ignoring her protests, he carefully stepped out into the bright sunlight. He carried a small, beautifully crafted bow that Ida hadn't even realized he had. An hour later, he returned with a rabbit. He skinned and cleaned it with a practiced, efficient grace, his knife flashing in the sun. As the meat roasted over the fire, the smell was so good it made Ida's stomach ache with hunger. When it was cooked, he handed her the largest share. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "You need it more than I do." He just pushed the meat toward her, his expression firm. "Eat," he said, and she did. Their words were few and far between, but they learned to communicate in other ways. A nod of thanks. A hand lifted in warning. A finger pointed toward the horizon to indicate a change in the weather. They were a team, a strange, unlikely pair, a widow and a warrior, learning to trust each other in the vast, empty wilderness. One evening, as the firelight danced on the cave walls, Wade began to draw shapes in the dirt with a stick. They were symbols Ida didn't recognize. He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "My people," he said, his English still halting, "children. They have no letters, no count." He gestured with his hands, as if gathering a group of small children around him. "Land is small now. Game is hard to find. The white man's world comes closer every day. My people need to learn. They need to read the treaties. They need to understand the numbers on the trader's scales." His voice was filled with a deep, aching sadness, a longing she understood all too well. The idea hit her like a bolt of lightning. She thought of all the graves she had seen along the trail, the small ones for children taken too soon. She thought of the mothers who couldn't even read the names carved into the wooden markers. She had always taken her own education for granted, the lessons her father had taught her at their kitchen table back in Missouri. For Wade's people, that knowledge was a locked door. Hesitantly, she took the stick from his hand. In the dirt, she carefully drew the letter A, then a B, then a C. "This is the beginning," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is the start of words." Wade's eyes lit up with a fierce, burning light. He traced the shapes with his finger, his touch clumsy but eager. He looked up at her, and his expression was one of such profound gratitude that it took her breath away. It was as if she had given him more than just food and medicine. It was as if she had given him a key, a weapon, a shield. Hope. That night, long after Wade had fallen asleep, Ida lay awake, staring at the letters still etched in the dirt. A strange warmth was spreading through her chest, a feeling she hadn't felt since Will was alive. It wasn't happiness, not yet. But it was something close. It was purpose. She had thought she was empty, that the grief had scraped her clean of everything that mattered. But maybe, just maybe, there was a spark left. The next morning, Wade spoke more than he had in all the days before. "You come with me," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "You teach the children." Ida listened, her throat tight. She could picture it so clearly. A village hidden in a canyon, full of children with wide, curious eyes, their futures narrowing with each passing year. She thought of the crooked cross over Will's grave, a lonely sentinel in the rain. The life they had dreamed of was gone forever. But maybe she could build something new, not to replace what she had lost, but to grow around the edges of her grief. She reached out and touched his arm. "If your people will have me," she said, her voice shaking but steady, "I will teach them." For a long moment he just studied her face, the firelight flickering in his eyes. Then he gave a single, solemn nod. It was an oath, a promise. That night, as she listened to the quiet, steady breathing of the man beside her, Ida no longer saw him as a shadow from her past, a reminder of the violence that had taken her husband. He was Wade, wounded, scarred, but alive with a quiet dignity she couldn't help but admire. The grief was still there, a sharp, constant ache in her chest. But now, it had something to press against, a fragile, tentative sense of direction. She couldn't bring Will back. She couldn't stop the war that was brewing between the settlers and the Apache. But she could do this. She could draw letters in the dirt. She could give a handful of children the keys to a larger world. And maybe, in doing so, she could save a part of herself. The journey south took them into a land that was both beautiful and terrifying. The desert stretched on forever, a vast, sun-baked canvas of red rock and pale sand. Wade moved with a quiet, steady confidence, a man in his own world. He knew where to find water hidden in the deep shadows of rocks, how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds, how to move without leaving a trace. Ida followed him, her body aching, her feet blistered, but a new kind of strength was building in her day by day. At night, they would build a small, smokeless fire, and Wade would point to the stars, murmuring their names in his own tongue. Ida would repeat the strange musical syllables, feeling them settle into her memory. For the first time since Will's death, her mind was reaching outward, instead of collapsing in on itself. On the seventh evening, they stood on the rim of a deep canyon. Below them, nestled by a winding stream, was a small village of lodges. Thin plumes of smoke rose from cooking fires, and the faint, happy sound of children's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. Wade paused, his face an unreadable mask. "My home," he said, his voice quiet. Ida's breath caught in her throat. She had tried to imagine this moment, but the reality of it was overwhelming. Her stomach twisted into a tight knot of fear. What would these people see when they looked at her? A white woman, an enemy, a reminder of all the soldiers, all the broken treaties, all the pain. Wade started down the steep, narrow trail without a backward glance. Ida took a deep breath and followed, her hands clammy, her heart pounding against her ribs. As they entered the village, a sudden silence fell. It was as if someone had thrown a switch. Women stopped grinding corn, men looked up from mending their bows. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, their wide, dark eyes full of suspicion. Every single gaze was fixed on Ida. She could feel the weight of their stares like physical blows. An old man, his face a road map of wrinkles and his long braids streaked with gray, approached them. He was clearly the elder, the chief. He spoke to Wade in a low, guttural tone that carried both authority and a deep, simmering anger. Wade answered him calmly, gesturing once toward Ida, then tapping his own chest where his wound had been. The elder's eyes narrowed. He looked Ida up and down, and she felt as if he were staring directly into her soul, weighing her, judging her. Finally, he spoke, his English heavily accented. "Why she here?" Ida swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. I want to help." The elder's brow furrowed. Wade spoke again, for a long time, his voice calm and firm. Ida could only catch a few words. "Teach, letters, children, our future." When he was finished, the elder said nothing. He just gave Ida one last long look, then turned and walked away. A low murmur rippled through the villagers. Wade motioned for Ida to sit near his lodge. She did as she was told, folding her hands in her lap, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. The first days were a special kind of hell. The children were curious, but cruel. They would gather around her, then giggle and point, mocking the strange sounds of her language. She would kneel in the dirt, drawing the letters, but they would lose interest and scatter, chasing each other in laughing, shrieking circles. The women watched her with cold, wary eyes, whispering behind their hands as she passed. The men ignored her completely. One afternoon, after the children had run off again, leaving her alone with her failed lesson in the dust, Ida finally broke. She sat right there in the dirt and cried, hot, bitter tears of frustration and despair. "I can't do this," she sobbed. "They don't want me here. This was a mistake." Wade came and crouched beside her. His wound was mostly healed now, though he still walked with a slight limp. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Strong," he said, the word he always used. Then softer, "Time. It takes time." She looked up at him, expecting to see pity, or maybe even an "I told you so" in his eyes. But all she saw was a quiet, unshakable certainty, and somehow, that was enough. It was an anchor in her storm of despair. So, the next day, she tried again. But this time, she didn't start with letters. She started with a song. It was a simple song her father had taught her, a little tune to help learn the alphabet. Her voice was shaky at first, but she sang it loud and clear. The children stopped their playing and crept closer, their heads cocked to one side. They giggled at her strange accent, but they listened. She clapped her hands in time with the music, coaxing them to sing with her. A few of the braver ones did, their small voices joining hers. The next day, more joined in. Soon, a chorus of little voices was singing the alphabet song. And after the song, when she drew the letters in the dirt, they watched with a new interest. Little hands reached for sticks of their own and began to scratch clumsy, shaky marks in the dust. A's that looked like crooked teepees. B's that looked like squashed bugs. But they were letters, and the children's eyes shone with a fierce, possessive pride. Seeing their children so happy, the women began to soften. One morning, an old woman silently placed a warm blanket by the entrance to Ida's lodge. Another day, a young mother pressed a piece of freshly roasted corn into her hand, her eyes shy but kind. The men still kept their distance, but the hostility was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. The elder watched it all from a distance, his face impassive. As the weeks turned into a month, the lessons grew. Ida taught the children how to spell their names, how to count with pebbles, how to recognize simple words: sun, fire, water, home. She found a large, flat stone that she used as a slate and a piece of chalky limestone to write with. The children treated the slate like a sacred object, passing it carefully from one to another, their faces screwed up in concentration as they tried to copy her letters. At night, Ida would sit outside Wade's lodge, exhausted but filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She still thought of Will every day. The ache of his loss was a permanent part of her, but it was no longer a raw, open wound. It was a scar, a place that had been broken and had healed stronger. One evening, Wade took her to the edge of the canyon. The firelight of the village twinkled below them like a handful of fallen stars. "They see you now," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Not white woman, not enemy." He paused, then looked at her. "They see teacher." Ida's throat tightened. She had to turn away so he wouldn't see the tears in her eyes. But even as she found her place, a new shadow fell. Not everyone accepted her. There was one young warrior, a man named Kale, whose eyes followed her everywhere, filled with a cold, hard hatred. One day, he confronted Wade by the stream where the women drew water. Ida couldn't understand the words, but she didn't have to. Kale's voice was sharp with anger, his hand stabbing the air in her direction. Wade answered him calmly, his voice never rising, but when the confrontation was over, Kale spat on the ground at Ida's feet before stalking away. The message was clear. Later, she asked Wade what Kale had said. Wade hesitated, his face troubled. "He says you bring trouble," he finally admitted. "He says where the white woman goes, the soldiers follow. He says you will bring death to us all." A chill went through Ida. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was a danger to these people, a poison she didn't even know she carried. "Maybe I should go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Wade shook his head, his expression fierce. "No," he said. "You bring life." He touched his own chest, over the place where his wound had been. Then he pointed toward the children, who were chasing each other near the stream, laughing as they shouted the letters of the alphabet into the clear desert air. "You bring this. This is life." Something inside Ida shifted then. For the first time since she had stumbled out of that bloody trading post, she believed she was more than just a widow, more than just a survivor. She was needed. She had a purpose. But as she looked at Kale, watching them from the shadows, she knew that her fight here was far from over. Because Kale was not just any warrior. Wade had told her his story. Kale was the brother of Jebediah Brown, the traitor Wade had killed, and Kale believed Ida was the reason his brother was dead. He believed she was a curse, and he would not rest until she was gone. The autumn air grew crisp, and the cottonwood trees along the stream turned a brilliant, fiery gold. Ida settled into the rhythm of the village, but the shadow of Kale's hatred was always there. He never spoke to her directly, but she could feel his eyes on her, cold and calculating. He started small, with whispers. He told the other warriors that Ida was a spy, sent by the army to map their location. He said her lessons were a way of teaching the children to betray their own people, to speak the white man's tongue so they could be more easily controlled. Some of the men started to look at her with suspicion again. The progress she had made felt fragile, like a spider's web in a high wind. Ida tried to ignore it, to focus on the children, on the small kindnesses of the women. But fear was a poison, and Kyle was spreading it through the village, one whisper at a time. One day, a small cache of dried meat went missing from the communal stores. It wasn't much, but in a village where every scrap of food was precious, it was a serious offense. Kyle immediately pointed the finger at Ida. "She is not one of us," he declared loudly in the center of the village. "She hoards our food, preparing to run back to her own kind." The elder called Ida before him. His face was grave. "Did you take the meat?" he asked, his voice stern. "No," Ida said, her voice shaking, but her gaze steady. "I would never do that." The elder studied her for a long time. "There are whispers against you," he said. "They say you are a bad omen." "I am only a teacher," Ida replied. "I have given you no reason to doubt me." The elder dismissed her, but the accusation hung in the air. The other women started to avoid her again. The children seemed confused, torn between their affection for her and the fear they heard in their parents' voices. Ida felt the walls closing in around her. She was an outsider again, a threat. The sabotage escalated. A bowstring was mysteriously cut. A water skin was found slashed. Each time, Kyle would somehow turn the suspicion back to Ida. He was clever, and his hatred for her was a powerful motivator. Ida felt helpless. She had no way to prove her innocence. It was her word against his, and she was the stranger. The breaking point came a few weeks later. One of the village children, a little girl named Chimalis, who was Ida's brightest student, fell violently ill. Her fever was high, and she was racked with terrible stomach pains. The medicine woman did everything she could, but the girl only grew weaker. Kale saw his chance. He burst into the center of the village, dragging a small leather pouch. "I found this hidden near the white woman's lodge," he roared, holding it up for all to see. "It is poison!" A gasp went through the crowd. Ida's heart plummeted. She had never seen the pouch before in her life. It was a lie, a terrible, vicious lie. "She has poisoned the child!" Kyle shouted, his eyes burning with triumph. "She is trying to kill us, one by one, starting with our children. She is a witch!" This was it. This was the accusation she could not fight. The fear in the villagers' eyes was now mixed with a terrifying rage. They began to close in around her, their faces contorted with anger and grief. Wade stepped in front of her, his body a shield, but he was just one man against the entire village. The elder pushed his way through the crowd, his face a thundercloud. He looked at the sick child, then at Ida, then at the pouch in Kale's hand. "Is this true?" he demanded of Ida, his voice like the rumble of an earthquake. "Did you do this thing?" "No!" Ida cried, her voice breaking. "I swear on my husband's grave, I did not. I love these children." "She lies!" Kyle spat. "She is a snake we have welcomed into our home." The elder looked torn. The life of a child hung in the balance, the word of a stranger against the word of one of his own warriors. The crowd was murmuring, their anger growing. "Take her!" the elder commanded two of the warriors. "Keep her in her lodge until we decide what is to be done." As they dragged her away, Ida locked eyes with Wade. She saw a desperate plea in his face. He believed her, but he was powerless. As they shoved her into her lodge, she knew this was the end. They would kill her. For a crime she did not commit, for a hatred she did not understand. She was going to die here, alone, in this canyon, so far from everything she had ever known. And the last thing she would be remembered as was a monster. Ida sat in the darkness of her lodge, listening to the angry murmurs of the village outside. Despair washed over her, cold and suffocating. Kyle had won. He had played on their fears, twisted their grief, and now they saw her as a demon. She thought of Will, and for the first time, she wished she had just laid down and died in the rain beside his grave. It would have been a kinder end than this. But then, another feeling started to burn through the despair. Anger. A hot, righteous anger. She was not a killer. She was not a witch. She was a teacher, and she would not let them take her life based on a lie. She had to fight. But how? She had no proof, no allies except for Wade, and he was outnumbered. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to think. Cale had planted the pouch. He must have. But why this child? Why Chimalis? She replayed the last few days in her mind, searching for any detail, any clue. She remembered seeing Cale near the stream a few days ago, gathering plants. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Many people gathered herbs for the medicine woman. But which plants? She tried to picture them. He had been near a patch of dark green leaves with small white bell-shaped flowers. She remembered her father, a man who knew the land, pointing out a similar plant back in Missouri. "That one's poison, Ida girl," he had told her. "Looks pretty, but it'll tie your guts in knots. They call it death bell." Her eyes flew open. Death bell. Could it be? She had to know. But she was a prisoner in her own lodge. Hours passed. The sun went down, and the village grew quiet. The silence was more terrifying than the anger had been. Then she heard a faint scratching at the hide flap of her lodge. It was Wade. He slipped inside, his face grim in the moonlight. "They will judge you at sunrise," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The child is weaker. They are demanding your life." "Wade, I didn't do it," she whispered. "It was Cale. I think he used a poison plant, one called death bell." Wade's eyes widened. "The plant with the white flowers? It grows by the stream. It is a strong poison. We teach our children never to touch it." "He poisoned her, Wade. I'm sure of it. He did it to frame me." "But how can we prove it?" Wade asked, the desperation clear in his voice. "His word against yours." "There has to be a way," Ida insisted, her mind racing. "The poison, it makes the stomach cramp. The fever. Is there an antidote? Something that would prove what it was?" Wade thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. "The medicine woman. She speaks of a root, a bitter root that grows high on the cliff face. She says it can fight the poison of the death bell if given in time. But it is very rare, and very hard to get." "Then that's what we have to do," Ida said, a desperate plan forming in her mind. "You have to get that root, Wade, and I have to convince them to let me give it to her." It was a wild gamble. If she was wrong, if it was some other sickness, the root could do nothing, or even make things worse. And even if she was right, would they ever let the poisoner give the child more medicine? But it was the only chance she had, the only chance Chimalis had. Before sunrise, Wade was gone, scaling the dark cliffs in search of a single rare root. As the first rays of light hit the canyon floor, the warriors came for Ida. They dragged her into the center of the village where the entire tribe was gathered. The elder stood before her, his face like stone. Little Chimalis lay on a blanket nearby, her breathing shallow, her mother weeping over her. Kyle stood beside the elder, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "You have been accused of poisoning this child," the elder said, his voice booming across the silent plaza. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Ida stood tall, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her voice was clear and strong. "I am innocent," she said, "and I can prove it. The child has not been cursed by me. She has been poisoned by the plant known as death bell." A murmur went through the crowd. "Cale gathered this plant by the stream 3 days ago. He gave it to the child, and then he planted that pouch by my lodge to cast the blame on me." "Lies!" Cale shouted. "She is trying to save her own skin by blaming me." "Then let me save her," Ida challenged, her eyes locking with the elders. "There is an antidote, a bitter root that grows on the cliffs. If she has been poisoned, as I say, the root will save her. If I am lying, it will do nothing. Let me give her the medicine. Let me prove my words. If I fail, then you can have my life." The crowd gasped. It was an audacious proposal. The elder stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He was weighing the life of his grandchild against the word of an outsider. It was an impossible choice. He looked at Chemalis, so small and still, and then back at Ida. For a long moment, the fate of the village seemed to hang in the balance. Just then, Wade appeared at the edge of the crowd. He was covered in dust, his hands were bleeding, but in his fist, he clutched a gnarled, dark-colored root. He pushed his way to the elder and held it out. "The bitter root," he said, his voice ragged with exhaustion. The elder looked from the root to Ida, then to his dying grandchild. He made his decision. "Prepare the medicine," he commanded the medicine woman, his voice heavy. "The white woman will give it to the child. Her life will be the price of failure." The medicine woman quickly ground the root into a paste and mixed it with water. Ida took the small bowl, her hands trembling. The entire village watched in breathless silence as she knelt beside Chemalis. She gently opened the little girl's mouth and tipped the bitter liquid in. Chemalis choked, then swallowed. And then there was nothing. Nothing but the sound of the wind whispering through the canyon. They waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Ida knelt by the child, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Kyle watched, a smug, cruel smile playing on his lips. He was sure she would fail. Then Chemalis coughed. A small, weak sound. Her eyelids fluttered. She moaned softly. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The medicine woman rushed forward and felt the child's forehead. "The fever," she whispered in awe. "It is breaking." Within the hour, the color began to return to Chemalis's cheeks. Her breathing grew stronger. She opened her eyes and asked for a drink of water. A joyous cry went up from her mother, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. The entire village seemed to exhale at once. Ida had been telling the truth. The elder turned to Kyle, and his face was a mask of cold, terrible fury. The game was over. Kyle's lie was exposed for all to see. He had been willing to sacrifice a child's life just to satisfy his own hatred. He tried to run, but the other warriors seized him. There was no trial. There was no discussion. His crime was unforgivable. "You are no longer one of us," the elder declared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You have betrayed your people. You have brought shame upon the spirit of your brother. You will be cast out. Walk from this place and never return. If any man sees your face here again, he will be free to kill you." They took Kale's weapons, his horse, everything. They marched him to the edge of the village lands and left him there, with nothing but the clothes on his back, to face the harsh judgment of the desert. Justice had been done. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the canyon, the elder came to Ida. He stood before her, and for the first time, she saw not a stern chief, but just a man, a grandfather, his eyes full of a gratitude so profound it needed no words. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder for a moment. It was a gesture of acceptance, of belonging. She was no longer the outsider. She was the teacher, the healer. She was one of them. The seasons turned. Winter dusted the canyon rims with snow, and Ida's lessons moved indoors, crowded around the warmth of the fire. Spring came, and with it, a sense of peace she had never thought she would feel again. With Kale gone, the last of the suspicion and fear had vanished. She was truly a part of the village, her life woven into the fabric of theirs. She planted seeds with the women, she laughed at the children's stories, she listened as the elders recounted the history of their people, and every evening she sat with Wade by the fire. Their friendship had deepened into something quiet and strong, a bond forged in violence and grief, and tempered by trust and respect. But as the days grew warmer and the canyon bloomed with life, a familiar restlessness began to stir in Ida's heart. It wasn't the raw grief for Will. That had softened into a gentle ache, a sad but beautiful memory. This was something different. She had come to this place with nothing, a broken woman fleeing a nightmare. And here, she had found a purpose. She had found a home. She had found a family. And that was the problem. She had become so much a part of their world that she had started to forget her own. She looked at Wade. at his kind eyes and his rare, gentle smile, and she felt a warmth that both thrilled and terrified her. He was Apache. She was White. In this small, hidden canyon, they were just Ida and Wade. But out in the world that was constantly pressing in on them, they were enemies. What right did she have to stay here? What right did she have to love him? She was still a widow, and he was not her husband. The thought felt like a betrayal. The decision grew in her mind, a painful, necessary thorn. She had to leave. She had given them the gift of letters. She had saved a child's life. Her work here was done. It was time to go before the bond between her and Wade deepened into something that would only bring them both pain. One night, under a sky so full of stars it looked like spilled diamonds, she knew it was time. She waited until the village was asleep, then went to find Wade. He was sitting by his fire, staring into the flames. He looked up as she approached, his expression calm. "You not sleep?" "I need to talk to you," she said, her hands twisting in her shawl. She sat down across the fire from him, the flames dancing between them. The silence stretched on, filled only by the crackle of the wood. Finally, she took a deep breath. "I'm leaving, Wade. Tomorrow." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Wade's hand, which had been stirring the coals with a stick, went still. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look at her. "Where you go?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "West, maybe. Find a settlement. It's just, I can't stay. It isn't right." He finally looked at her, and she saw a flicker of pain in his usually stoic eyes. "You think this not your place?" "I think I've stayed too long," she whispered, the words tearing at her throat. "I came here with nothing. You gave me a home. But it's your home, not mine. I have to find my own path." His gaze searched hers, deep and unflinching. She half expected him to argue, to try and convince her to stay. She almost hoped he would. But instead, he just gave a slow, sad nod. "If that is your heart." Her own heart felt like it was breaking. Why wasn't he fighting for her? The rest of the evening passed in a strained, painful silence. He shared his meal with her, and they ate without speaking, the unspoken words a heavy weight between them. As he stared into the dying embers of the fire, he finally spoke, his voice so low she could barely hear him. "I wish," he said, not looking at her, "I wish I could cook for you forever." The simple, clumsy words hit her with more force than a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the raw, naked truth in his eyes. He wasn't letting her go because he didn't care. He was letting her go because he cared too much to make her stay. A sound that was half a laugh and half a sob escaped her lips. "That's the strangest proposal I've ever heard," she said, tears streaming down her face. A small, uncertain smile touched his lips. "Strange?" She shook her head, wiping at her eyes. "Strange," she said, "but beautiful." He returned her smile, and in that moment, under the vast, starry sky, Ida knew she was making a terrible mistake. This was her home. This was her family. This was her future. The path she had been searching for wasn't somewhere out in the wilderness. It was right here, sitting across the fire from her. Morning broke, soft and golden over the canyon. Ida stood outside the lodge, the chill air on her cheeks, watching the village come to life. His words echoed in her mind. "I wish I could cook for you forever." It was a promise of ordinary days, of shared meals, of a life built together, one small, quiet moment at a time. It was everything she had ever wanted with Will, and it was everything she now wanted with Wade. The road she thought she had to walk alone suddenly seemed impossibly empty. Her place was here. Her roots had found their soil. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire again, Wade looked at her, his eyes full of a quiet question. "You still go?" he asked softly. Ida met his gaze, and for the first time in a very long time, her heart was completely at peace. "No," she said, her voice clear and sure. "I think I'll stay." Relief washed over his face, a slow, beautiful sunrise. "Good," he said simply. Ida laughed, a real, happy laugh. "That's all you have to say?" A rare, wide smile spread across Wade's face. "I already say enough." She reached across the fire and took his hand. Their fingers interlaced, a silent promise in the flickering light. The grief for Will would always be a part of her, a scar on her heart. But she knew now that a heart could have more than one scar. It could be broken and still have room for a new love, a new life. As she looked at the man beside her, at the children who called her teacher, at the canyon that had become her sanctuary, Ida Gaines knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was finally home. If you enjoyed this story, and you want to hear more tales of survival, courage, and the strange twists of fate, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and allows me to keep bringing these stories to light. Thank you for listening.